Hello YouTube, I hope you're having a great day today. Today I want to take a look at Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End. This is one of his first novels that he publishes in the early 50s, 1953. So I want to take a look at this. This is considered by many to be one of his best novels of all time, and kind of so forth. One of the reasons why I'm bringing this to you now is because I actually just read it. I just read it for the first time earlier today, and I'd done some research on it and so forth just recently, and I already owned a copy of it. So you know how we all have like copies of books that we haven't read yet? Well, that was in my list of maybe 40 or 50 books that I hadn't read yet. I was inspired to pick it up and read it, so I did, and I really enjoyed it. And while it's fresh and kind of new to me, and I've just done a lot of research on it, I figured it'd be good for me to kind of bring it to you as a review. It's also, I think, useful to kind of talk about things that I'm reading right now. A lot of these works are older works. You know, again, my channel cares about the older classics of fantasy, science fiction, and horror. So, you know, older books like these, I think, that I'm reading currently to kind of talk about what I'm currently reading, introducing, and so forth. I also think it's an important part of the conversation of this channel and so forth, too. So, I also like to be very, very open in saying these are still things I'm exploring. There are still writers out there that wrote a long time ago that I'm still reading things from. You know, there's no writer out there that I haven't read where I've read every single thing they've written, you know, and published. You know, there's lots of writers out there where I'm still learning, I'm still growing, I'm still reading new things and so forth. So let's talk about Childhood's End a little bit. I came to really appreciate how much Childhood End is really kind of respectable among the science fiction community while I was researching The Left Hand of Darkness. Now, for those of you who follow my channel, you'll know that I just reviewed The Left Hand of Darkness for you, and as a part of my reviews, one of the things I like to do is do some research on them and so forth prior to me doing my video for you. And Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness is considered by many to be one of the best, you know, science fiction novels written of all time. And as I was going and reviewing a lot of top 10 lists online, I was seeing Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End in those books, not some of the books that I'm more familiar with, like Rendezvous with Rama or 2001: A Space Odyssey, but instead Childhood's End, and I thought that was pretty interesting to me. I did some research on it and said, let's go ahead and read it, because I got it right here on my shelf. I just haven't read it yet. It's just in my queue, and so forth. So I decided to go ahead and do that, and I figured I'd review it for you here, especially since I just, yesterday actually, I started reviewing two other classics for you. I did Robert E. Heinlein's The Roads Must Roll, which is a short story. I talked about that with you guys too, and he's a big author. And that's the first Robert Heinlein story I reviewed for you, and that's also one of his first short stories. So it's very early in his career, just like this will be for Clarke. But also I reviewed for you Flowers for Algernon too, which I'll be publishing here shortly. So it's kind of feels like I'm in like a science fiction highest hits right now with everything from Ursula K. Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, Arthur C. Clarke. Heinlein, Flowers for Algernon. These are many of people's greatest or most well-known, certainly, science fiction writers out there with some of these big-name works. So it kind of fits, too, for me to do a Clarke novel that may be considered by many to be his best. And I did some research. Childhood's End is actually one of the first novels he publishes, and publishes it in '53. And he was right near the beginning of his publishing career of fiction. Most of his works have been picked up by Ballantine Books in the early 50s, like in 1950, 51, and they picked up several scripts that he had written, as well as some short stories and such. Before that, he had really just written a few short stories that have been published. One of those short stories is actually called The Guardians, and that will actually become kind of the first third of this story that he'll kind of rewrite and republish, and it was very, very well received, and kind of like Abraham. It actually reminds me a little bit about Abraham Merritt's The Moonpool. He wrote this well-received kind of exploration horror story in the 1910s. It was hugely popular, put him on the map in a big way. Before that, he'd only published a few short stories, and then he turns around and takes that short story and uses it as the beginning of his novel, The Moonpool, which is the first novel he writes. He publishes it a couple of years later in the late 19-teens. So I think it's in 1918 to be honest. So in the same way, a few years later, he's going to publish a novel that uses that short story as kind of the first third of his novel, Childhood's End. And I did some research. Childhood's End is considered, like I said, by a lot of people to be one of his best novels. Many critics, many fans of Clarke consider this his favorite novel. In fact, he does too. He had regularly said that Childhood's End, looking back at his career, is probably his favorite novel. And again, it was one of the first things he sold to Ballantine Books. They published another of the books he sold first because it was more ready. He wasn't sure what the end of this would be 100%, so he actually sold it without an ending. And it wasn't until he really committed to an ending that I think he was willing to publish it and so forth. So it's actually, I think, the second of his books that was actually published, but again, it's one of the first ones that he wrote, and so forth. So again, it's kind of an opportunity to see him at his first. But like many great artists, his one of your first works tends to be your most definitive and your strongest, and his was too. This was a story he'd been working on for a while. He'd been working on the short story for a while. He understood this world, and so forth. And he had been working on the novel for several years before he published it. And so, like a lot of folks that are out there, again, it's going to have that. It's got it's got a strong cachet to it, and what's happening. Basically, what's going to happen in Childhood's End. It takes place in the near future. He envisions a space race between the Soviet Union and the U.S. successfully. And in the heart of that space race, in the introduction, you'll come across the idea that these aliens from outer space are going to visit the Earth, and all their giant spaceships are going to land in all the different cities, the big ones around the world, and they basically announce the arrival of this new group of people that are going to take over kind of the world and help them out. An attack will be launched against them. It'll fail completely and miserably. It'll be brushed aside as if it never even happened, and then that's it. Kind of take over. And basically, the first part starts off with them having taken over a few years later. And you're going to see what Earth is like under these people that the humans call the overlords, who they've never actually even seen, who are administering the world kind of through their proxy, who's the Secretary General of the UN. He's going to be your major point of view character for the first for the first third of the novel, because he doesn't know them either, and he's just as curious as any other human as to what they look like and so forth, what their agenda is and so forth. But he trusts them in ways that many humans don't, because he's seen the results of their actions, and he knows he has what's best, and he's following some of the edicts. He's going to be stolen and away by some other terrorists and so forth, who are going to interrogate him and question him and so forth, try to find out what he knows about these invaders and such. So there's some stuff that happens, but it's like a classic Arthur Clarke piece, and it's got more thinking in it and so forth. And then the first part will conclude, which is of course the end of the short story, and then the second part will pick up decades later, like a lot of decades later, and so forth. And basically you're going to have three separate parts. The first part takes place about 5 years after the invasion, or the arrival, based on your point of view of these aliens and the folks that arrived with them. And then the second part is going to be about 50 years later, or so, and then the third part is going to take place even later than that, and so forth. And you're going to be following these different sort of plot lines that are happening. But this book is not a particularly long book, as you can see. This is a reprint of the 53 version from in the 70s by Del Rey Books in the early part of its run in the 70s for Ballantine Books after it took over its major imprint for science fiction and fantasy. So it's still being printed by Ballantine Books at that time. So they still have the copyright rights for it and so forth. But as you can see, it's like 220 pages long in this book, and this is, again, a pretty fast read. I just read it today in one sitting. It took me about 5 hours to read it, all told. And I just sat down and read it, and I didn't stop it. That's good. I mean, when you come across a book like this that you're enjoying and you're obsessed over, and you just want to finish, that you're happy with that. And it was a very quick read because these three sections are divided by years and years and years. So you do have this opportunity to kind of get a feel for 50, 60, 70 pages each for the three different sort of snapshots of these different times that's happening during the plot lines and so forth. It's very Arthur C. Clarke. It's very big pictures, big ideas, and so forth, which we're going to see on a big scale, and so forth. Now, Arthur C. Clarke, one of his major characters near the end, is going to be a black character. I do think he tries to have a black character as one of his main point of view characters, and arguably the point of view character of the entire story. And I think one of the reasons he does that is because, much like other people who were writing at this time, he sometimes likes a counter-narrative in science fiction. You also saw this, by the way, in Earth Abides, that was written by George Stewart's post-apocalyptic world, where this white guy ends up marrying this black woman, and they end up having children in the settlement. And so everybody else who follows there in the settlements are all, biracial, half white and half black. and so forth. And you would not normally find a black woman, right, who wasn't being written in sort of a traditional sort of a black style. I'll actually link you to that below if you're interested in it, kind of in my review thereof of that book. It's also being published about the same time. So there is this small, but there kind of counter-narrative. It's very rare. You're not going to find it very often. But Clarke puts it in one of his first novels, and I think it's very interesting that he does, that one of his kind of lead characters is kind of a black man, and so forth. And I think it's very interesting. I do think he doesn't. I think when he talks about the black man's race, he kind of comes across as a white academic man from that era. For example, he will talk about the loss, how racism has now left the world and so forth, based on the arrival of the overseers and such, and these overlords that have arrived at Earth and have gotten rid of racism and so forth. And he'll talk about that, and then in it he'll say, and so for that reason, the N-word is now being used without it being an epithet by everybody. Well, I don't think that would actually happen. I think that man would move to another word. I don't think that would do that. That is clearly naive by Clarke. And I think there's a couple other times where he just talks about the experience of black men prior to it that he just doesn't know what he's talking about and so forth. And you can tell he didn't interview a bunch of black people or something like that, and so forth. You can tell that he's trying his best and so forth. And again, he's probably, I do agree that his idea of putting a black man in a strong role like that is very important, and a POV character too, for both parts 2 and 3. I think it's very compelling, but at the same time, and I think it's a good counter narrative in science fiction. There are a handful of these stories. For example, there was one that famously ended with this guy in a spacesuit who you never saw his race. You just knew he was a man, and then in the end, he takes off his helmet, and you see his black skin underneath it, which changes the narrative of the story completely and totally. So they do have these counter narratives and stuff out there in science fiction at this time. It's not very often, which is why it's noteworthy. And so praise to Clarke for doing it, but again, it can feel a little odd coming to it this later on. You can see that he's awkward. He doesn't fully understand the stuff and so forth. But that's fine. He'll mature as a writer, I think, later on and such too. But anyway, this is Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. It has been made recently into a miniseries in 2015. But other than that, there's not really been, I think, a lot of follow-up, which I think is sad. And I do think, in some ways, I think Arthur C. Clarke has become kind of one of the more forgotten of the sort of big-name writers for science fiction at the time. For example, when researching this earlier today, I came across blogs I was just trying to take a look and see where top science fiction stories of all time, novels and so forth, and trying to see where some contemporary people were putting this novel. Because at the time, and even by Clarke himself, and I can go back to top 10 lists in the 70s and in the 80s that I was finding when I was finding, Ursula K. Le Guin stuff, I saw his novel in those. So I was like, where is he today? For example, I saw multiple top lists that didn't have anything about Arthur C. Clarke in it at all. And I'm not talking like top 10. Like, I could come across multiple sites that had top 100 science fiction novels of all time. And they included some older stuff like Frankenstein, as well as H.G. Wells and stuff, but no Arthur C. Clarke, Asimov, Heinlein, but no Arthur C. Clarke, which I found to be weird, and so forth. And there were top 25 lists that didn't have, anything by Clarke in them, typically. And I think that's kind of sad. I think that 3 works of Clarke are definitively top 100 at the very least. Rendezvous with Rama, 2001, and Childhood's, and having read it, I think it's a strong story. It's a compelling read. It's very fast, and it's sweeping in what it talks about. And it deals with a lot of things that I think were new for the time. So I do think that Clarke should have some more respect. I think sometimes he does with contemporary audiences, and that's fine. That happens with a lot of writers and so forth and such. So anyway, if you've read Childhood's End, or if you've heard of it, but you've never actually bothered to read it, I'm going to challenge you to do so. Again, I did it today. It took me about 5 hours to do. And if you were to spread that out, you could do it, 5 days over a week or something like that. Or if you can do there's like 16 chapters, you can do 2 chapters a day. Or there's 3 parts, you could do 1 part each day and spend maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours on it, and read it in just a few days. A lot of these older novels aren't going to take you a long time to read. They understand how to get you into a story and out of a story very quickly. And since this is one of his first novels, again, there's going to be some times where I think he's a little bit more raw in writing and so forth, but I do think he also writes it with an energy and a verb that makes the story really work to me, and so forth. So that's Childhood's End. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. I'll be happy to explore it more with you, talk about some of the things I didn't want to talk about because I don't want to get too heavy in the spoilers, but I'm happy to talk with you about the various concepts, plots, characters, and so forth if you want to talk about them more further. And let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. If you like this video, there's no reason not to hit the subscribe button. As I said earlier, I really like to kind of digest a lot of these sort of old classics that have been forgotten by the constant release of new stuff. And then finally, hey, I want to thank you so much for watching this video, taking some time out of your day, because at the end of these days, we all have busy days, busy lives, and so forth. So the fact that you took 15, 20 minutes out of your day to spend with me, that's just so humbling, and I really appreciate that. So thanks so much.